Welcome back to the Everything History podcast, and this is episode 31, I believe. And I have on today Professor Laurence. Professor Laurence is a guest lecturer here at the University of Illinois in the Classics Department, and an extremely educated and talented archaeologist of ancient Greece and Rome. After the spring 2016 semester, she will be leaving to go back to Greece, but I got the chance to ask her a few questions about Augustus Caesar, specifically how Augustus and his followers used art, architecture, and entertainment during his time in power. With that, let's begin.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Let me start off by asking about Julius Caesar. What building projects did the elder Caesar commission?
He started quite a few. Didn't finish as many that there was. So, for instance, the Basilica Julia that was named after he and his family in the Forum. He actually commissioned a whole forum that was the Basilica. That was the Julian Forum. That was really made more as an extension of the Roman Forum, because there so many monuments were being put up in the Roman Forum to sort of make more room.
Why was Julius Caesar commissioning projects like these? What did he intend for the purposes to be of the projects?
Yeah, so as the Roman Republic was sort of slowly disintegrating, more and more money was flooding into Rome, and all of these successful, triumphant generals were coming in and starting all of these building projects. But some of the problems were that, first off, because of the ultra competition among Roman senators, it sometimes was really difficult for one of these triumphant generals to be able to build a big public building, because the other senators didn't want them to get credit for it. And things like aqueducts and that sort of stuff, they're just not as sexy, that they're not as exciting as a temple or something like that. And so what would often happen was that these generals would have to build things on their own private land, and they tended to build temples to their favorite deities. And so Julius Caesar was, by the time he defeated Pompey especially, was in this kind of enviable position that he was dictator of Rome, and he had so much money, and he had so little competition that he was able, something like the Forum, to actually buy up property and start to build these sometimes slightly less exciting but really important building projects.
So he was able to do things that previous senators, ambitious people of Rome weren't able to do before, because he had more free reign.
Yeah, power and ability. And there was also this worry among he and other Romans at the time that Rome didn't look the way that they wanted it to. That there were all of these great cities like Alexandria that had all of these gorgeous buildings and public monuments, and that Rome was a little bit of like the ugly stepchild in terms of it. They were trying to be the leading power of the Mediterranean, but their city didn't look like it.
Okay,
Yeah.
And so Julius Caesar died, of course.
Let's hope so, or else he's still kicking somewhere.
Or he's still wandering around. But he left many projects unfinished, because obviously it takes a long time to build these projects. He was only dictator for 5 years. But he left a lot of them unfinished. How did his successor, Octavian or Augustus, use this to his advantage?
So, yeah, Augustus used a lot of what Caesar did to his advantage, and used the especially in the early periods of Octavian's political career after Julius Caesar died. One of his biggest advantages was being Caesar's adopted son.
Caesar,
yeah, and he really tried to then connect himself to all of these Julian projects. And it was actually probably pretty lucky for him that Julius Caesar left so many things unfinished, so that he could swoop in and be the pious son, and complete these things that his father would have if he hadn't been violently murdered. That he's doing his
duty to his father.
Exactly.
His father's life.
Yeah, exactly.
So would you say he was fulfilling not only like a political role there by building these projects and having his name associated with them, but also filling some sort of moral obligation, a virtuous obligation to his father, or at least that's how he wanted it to be seen?
Yeah, I would say that they were sort of linked hand in hand. That I don't doubt his piousness and the love that he might have felt for Caesar, but it was also a very savvy political move to use those things for his benefit, and to be able to be, while Octavian was while Mark Antony was out gallivanting in the East, that he could stay at home and finish these works.
And Augustus is famous for understanding the mistakes of his adopted father, but did he learn from Julius Caesar when it came to these public projects?
Yeah, I think probably. Augustus starts his own forum to increase that sort of space. He also uses a lot of his own money, now that he's the richest man in Rome by far, in order to sort of expand his political message. He's also very, again, luckily and savvily, has his right-hand man, Agrippa, next to him to be able to take care of some of, again, the less, I don't want to keep on using sexy because that's just weird, but the less, grandiose building projects that Agrippa can do a lot of the aqueducts and that sort of thing, and Augustus can get the credit that he deserves for all of these gorgeous things.
And Augustus became known over his reign for his disciplined nature and the principles that he liked to put off in his agenda. Was this sort of attitude evident in his constructions as well, his projects?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's again a very savvy public persona of contrasting himself against this very Eastern Mark Antony, and that not that he wasn't naturally more of an Apolline figure against Mark Antony's Dionysus, but could sort of use that for his benefit. And in a lot of the architecture and the archaeology of what Augustus builds, he really harkens back to this classical period of ancient Athens following the Persian Wars, that is opposed to a lot of the really extravagant sculptural programs and buildings that come about in the Hellenistic age, like the Great Altar at Pergamon or things like that. That in Augustus's forum, he builds caryatids like there were on the Erechtheion and things like that harken back to this. Because Greece, following the Persian Wars, was also presenting this very restrained, composed version of being Greek, and he was presenting the similar composed version of being Roman that was part of his personality.
Very good. And speaking of his own personal nature, what do we know about how Augustus lived in his private life?
Yeah, so according to the sources, he was very modest and lived a very sort of quote-unquote Republican, austere lifestyle that he lived. We have remains of his house up on the Palatine that's sort of connected to the Temple of Apollo. Again, this very political message of the temple being kind of an addition to his house, connecting himself to the gods, but still lived very modestly, which was, I think, a very deliberate contrast to the periods before, that in the late Republic, again, the rich were living in these huge, enormous villas and these grandiose palaces, basically, and were giving, some public building projects. And Augustus sort of flipped that on its head, that he was giving these huge public works and living modestly. We're told from the sources that he ate modestly, that he dressed modestly, that it was, again, this deliberate message that he's giving his money to the betterment of Rome and to the Roman people.
Yeah, and he wasn't putting off a message of like some later Julio-Claudian greed or being out of touch or anything like that.
Absolutely. You especially contrast the archaeological remains of Augustus's residence palace versus the Golden House of Nero, which was just enormous and lavish.
So obviously many famous structures were built during the age of Augustus, and a lot of them were, of course, commissioned by Augustus. And you alluded to this a little bit, but what were some of the building projects that were not commissioned by Augustus?
So most famously is the Pantheon of Agrippa, which not much remains of except for the inscription that attributes it to Agrippa.
Do you mean like the remains of the original Pantheon?
Yes, yeah, the one that was built by Agrippa. Most of that does not remain, just the inscription, because what we have is the Hadrianic-Trajanic version of that temple.
Reconstruction, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned other projects, so Augustus maybe had a hand in these things, but like he was allowing other people to fulfill this role a little bit.
Yeah.
What kind of people was he allowing to put their name on these projects and whatnot?
Yeah, so you have Agrippa. So again, I do Roman Greece, and so a lot of what I know is how this unfolds in Greece. That you see Olympia, especially that Agrippa goes to Olympia. He refurbishes the Temple of Zeus. There's the remains of an inscription that credit this to him. And then Herod the Great, also, who's a great friend and enemy of Augustus, comes to Olympia and also gives just a tremendous amount of money to the sanctuary in order to reinvigorate the games that he saw as being in decline.
So this age of Augustus, he's putting a large presence in Greece. Why do you think he's doing that?
I think there's a really difficult, complicated relationship from its inception between Rome and Greece. Right. Rome is sort of an ancestor of the Greeks in some ways. Descendant is what I meant to say, of the Greeks in some ways, in that Aeneas comes after the fall of Troy and founds Rome, is the first to come to Italy, and then his descendants, Romulus and Remus, found Rome. And so much of Roman mythology and architecture and literature is really dependent on Greece. And then you have, in the late Republic, as Rome conquers all of Greece and the Hellenistic East, they have this really tricky problem of presenting themselves both as part of this Greek culture but superior to it as well. And then you have the further complication of Augustus's great rival Mark Antony living in the East, falling in with Cleopatra, and having so much popularity in the East, sort of living this Hellenistic lifestyle. And so when Augustus comes into power, Octavian Augustus comes into power, you can't just ignore Greece. Right. It's where he'd won the Battle of Actium, different things like that. Yeah, exactly. So he has to acknowledge it, but figure out how to use it to his advantage.
So perhaps he's trying to lift up the more Roman values that are in Greece. Did he have, like, for example, like, it seems that Romans quite like the Spartans. Did Augustus quite like the Spartans as well?
Absolutely, and it's in the Augustan age that you really see new buildings around Sparta. Especially there was this festival for Artemis or Thea, where they would line the altar of Artemis with these different cheeses, and boys would come and try to steal the cheese, and there would be men with whips who would try to stop you from it. And this became much more of a spectacle in the Augustan period, that you sort of get the sense that that people actually traveled to Sparta to watch, to be spectators of that sort of Spartan austere lifestyle. And yeah.
So going back to Augustus's own projects that he was personally commissioning and stapling his name on, essentially, what was his agenda for these kind of projects? Like not only what was his agenda, but was it subtle or was it obvious to the Roman people? Or can we tell?
I don't think it was subtle. There was a lot. I mean, Augustus is known as, in his own Res Gestae, which is sort of his essay of all of the things that he had done. He even says that he found the city a city of brick and he left it a city of marble. Right. So he was making this the capital that it was meant to be. But the first order of business really seemed to, again, be that piety of going and completing Julius Caesar's projects and building and dedicating temples that were connected to him being the avenger of his father's death. Right. He built a temple to divine Julius Caesar. Right. In order to celebrate that divinity of his father, as a way to sort of not say that he was divine himself, but link himself to somebody that was.
So this temple of divine Julius Caesar, so Augustus is building this, like you just alluded to it there, you basically said it now, but so more clearly, Julius Caesar is now seen as a god, essentially, and this is what this temple is commemorating. And Augustus is building this for more than one reason, essentially.
Yes.
So not only is it commemorating his father and that piety kind of thing, but also I'm the son of a god.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. Which was very dicey to do in Rome.
An adopted father. So how do they get around that kind of... Because there's a bit of a loophole he has to work through.
Right,
the fact that
right.
He is blood related, but he's not the actual son of Caesar.
Blood related, but not the actual son, but adopted, and so that was important. I think there was a bit of that went on in Rome, and with the successors of Augustus, right? Tiberius was not his son, and that, on and on and on. That there was so much of this adoption that it became kind of...
Are you saying that adoption is like, in eyes of Roman law and people, is basically just as good as being...
I think so. I don't know 100%, I gotta say. But, yeah, that's my sense of it.
Right, so that's like obviously, some people are the legitimate sons of them, but like if you're adopted, perhaps it's even seen as more austere because you were chosen by this great man.
In some ways, yeah.
Right. And some of these projects of Augustus and during this age, the people commissioned in public works, private works, temples, things like that. How were they different or the same before this age of triumvirs and whatnot? Before the Republic started to really descend into these civil wars between the Caesars and all their enemies and things like that. Are these projects quite akin to that pre-imperial kind of age, or are they an extension of it?
They're much more grandiose, for sure. That we actually, before a lot of these really triumphant generals who are coming in and putting their footprint on Rome, we really have relatively little archaeological evidence of some of these big building projects. And so then with Augustus, it just sort of explodes. Yeah, that you have so much money. And again, justifying your presence, justifying your piety and putting this stamp on it, that you really get these big, beautiful building projects. Yeah.
And we mentioned a lot of these public works, but what were some of these public works being made? Like, were they like water resources? What kind of resources were they making?
Yeah, so there were the fora, places to come together and shop and govern and different things like that. Water resource management, so aqueducts, bringing water to the city, Nymphaea, like the end point where you actually go and collect the water. It was under Pompey, Julius Caesar's rival, and then Augustus, that you start to have the very first permanent theaters in Rome, so places for entertainments. Up until this point, you only would put up sort of a temporary stands and tear them down before the festival. Temples, so all of these baths for sure. There were so many baths throughout Rome that again got bigger and bigger and more grandiose as the emperors started to use these as really ways of showing their altruism to the people, right? That these aren't just things. They're not like Nero building this huge palace for himself. In order to curry the favor of the people, you build these huge things that the people are able to use, rather than something that's just for you and your cronies.
Yeah, and it seems to be, obviously, Augustus putting a massive emphasis on Rome itself, the city, but was he putting emphasis around his entire, you wouldn't want to say empire, we're going to say empire. So is he putting emphasis around the empire as well with these kind of projects, or is he like leaving some things, to the wayside?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on where you go, I guess. But so, for instance, going back to Greece, in Athens, he completes the forum that Julius Caesar started. So again, just like with the building projects in Rome, he's coming in and finishing something that his father would have liked to do. Just like in Rome, you have Agrippa come in and build some extra building projects. There's a great big Odeon that goes smack dab in the center of the Athenian marketplace, which was both, again, this gift to the Athenians, celebrating their oratory and a place to come and debate and that sort of thing, but also this very clear sign that the age of democracy is over, right? That the Agora was the seat of Athenian government, and now right in the center of it, you put this huge theater, a bunch of temples, that sort of thing, that sort of marks that that's not what we're using this for anymore.
Yeah, and right there, you mentioned like the tone of these kind of works being created. Now Augustus would have called himself the princeps of Rome, first citizen of Rome, not the emperor, right? Very intentionally, but was there an imperial tone to these projects, like that this is all one one entity. This isn't a democratic kind of thing I'm creating here. But do these projects project a Republican kind of attitude, or maybe do you know what I mean? Are they pushing off like an imperial kind of attitude that like there is one chief leader of this?
Yeah, it's more the latter, which was, especially in the East, there were very different things that went on in the West versus the East. But Greek East had been under Hellenistic kings for centuries at this point. And so it was a language that at this point they were very, very comfortable with. So like we were saying before, that in Rome, Augustus couldn't call himself a god, called his father a god, I'm just the son of a god. But in Greece, Hellenistic kings had been called gods had been given divine honors since 300 BC, since before then, even since Alexander the Great. And so it was a language that was their language of honor. It was their language of appreciation of the gifts and the peace and the stability that Augustus was bringing to them.
So it was far easier to project that kind of attitude of divine nature, of dominance in the East than it was in the West?
Absolutely, yeah. So on the Acropolis, you have a temple to Roma and Augustus. At the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia, there's a temple to the Mother of Gods that's converted into a temple to Augustus. So in the Greek East, you have these much more explicit religious places for Augustus and for Rome as well.
Okay. And shifting more to a kind of longue durée look at this, it seems that many of these projects left a lasting impact on Rome, obviously, himself stating that he left the city of marble. But did they provide some sort of like change in art and architecture and movements that we can detect? Like Alexander obviously projected this image of this Alexandrian kind of idea of art and architecture. Did this Augustan age kind of have that similar sort of impact, or was it something different?
Absolutely. That rather like Alexander the Great, that after Alexander the Great, everybody wanted to connect themselves to Alexander the Great because he was so incredible and he did so many amazing things. After Augustus, everybody wanted to connect themselves back to Augustus. So you have this with the other Julio-Claudians, connecting them back to the founder of their dynasty. But really, pretty much with the beginning of every new dynasty, there was this sense of, I'm going to be the new Augustus, that I'm going to come in and be as great a ruler and bring this news. Because again, after each dynasty would fall, you'd have a little bit of civil war until the next dynasty would take its place. And so that was mirroring Augustus and Mark Antony and all of these civil wars of previous generations. So, absolutely, you have this sense over and over again.
And now, I wanted to speak a little bit about entertainment, perhaps not as much as the art and architecture, but what sort of entertainment, like sport, theater, things like that? We mentioned theater a little bit, but what sort of presence did that have in Rome during Augustus' time?
A big one, yeah, that it was especially under the previous, again, all of these triumphant generals that you sort of have this boom in the entertainment industry in Rome, that it was a way of, again, currying favor with the public, that you would have huge gladiatorial displays, wild beast fights. So when Pompey was inaugurating his theater, and he had, hundreds of animals that he transported from Egypt that he brought to fight each other and to fight against humans, which you can imagine just how to wrangle them, and then put them on boats, take the boats across the Mediterranean, just the infrastructure that would have been involved in order to do that. Julius Caesar, when he was aedile, that he put on gladiatorial displays of 320 pairs of gladiators, just this excessive amount of display. But I think it was Julius Caesar, I hope I'm not saying this wrong, that I also remember that Julius Caesar was sort of, he gave all of these games to the people, either then or after he became dictator, but he also got a little bit unpopular with the people because he would just, finance them. He would sit there, but he didn't pay attention. He did his work and just seemed bored with the games, and that the people sort of saw that as him being yes, too much. And so there was this weird dynamic of giving the games, but you have to be excited about the games, but then you look forward to Nero or Commodus that you can't be too excited about them, that it's this very delicate balance indeed. But also Augustus is very famous for, again, he's trying to go back to these Republican ideals. And so he actually also institutes very rigid seating regulations about where people are allowed to sit in the theaters and in the amphitheaters based on your status and your sex and different things like that. So very conscious of all of that.
And was Augustus making a distinct transition during his time? Like, did he change, like you mentioned a lot of rule changes there, but did he change the way these games were put on? Because as you mentioned, often Roman citizens, these ambitious senators with money and whatnot, they would put on these lavish games free of charge, and it'd be trying to basically to one-up each other constantly. Right. So when Augustus came into power as an Octavian and later Augustus, did he change the way that was done? Absolutely.
That he basically outlawed anybody besides the emperor giving these games. So he was the only one who was providing them. After Augustus, it was only the emperors who were given a triumph. Right. It was the purview of the emperor to be able to do this. So it was always the emperor who was giving these gifts to the people. And then abroad, the same sort of displays would be that imperial cult, the cult of Augustus, would be the priest of that, would be the one who was giving the games. So it was always the benevolence of the emperor that was giving them.
And if other people got these games, it was at the approval of the emperor?
Absolutely, yeah. But he was always the go-between.
Right. And here, I'll bring it to an end a little bit here. We've mentioned a lot of what Augustus did right in regards to entertainment, his image, and these building projects, but did he have any major blunders or failures in regard to entertainment or art and architecture?
Not many that I can think of. I can't think of very many tremendous blunders. I mean, one, he had to alter his persona a bit, which was, again, a very savvy move that he... when, after the death of Julius Caesar, he had to sort of present himself as this sort of avenging son. But then once he became the very first emperor, it was again this very tricky dialogue of he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in order to be the first emperor, but Mark Antony was a fellow Greek who still had a lot of friends and cronies in Rome, and so this very delicate balance of how to do that.
The Civil War. Like, did you have trouble with that a little bit? Celebrating something so...
He did, but sort of? But he did it in very clever ways. So, for instance, in the Res Gestae, again, one of the things that he credits himself for are taking, I think it was like 60 golden statues of himself. No, 60 statues of himself that were made of some metal, and then making tripods, golden tripods that he dedicated to in various places around the city. And so it seems very pious and self-sacrificing, right? Taking all of these statues down. But maybe what you can see underneath that is all of these statues that were now not part of his political message, that it was sort of an excuse for him to take them down and use them to his advantage in order to erase them from memory, right?
And perhaps, too, he, learning from the mistakes of his father. Like, Julius Caesar seemed to have a problem often when he was dictator, especially when he got back to Rome after 45, that people kept wanting to give him, like, king kind of honors, like calling him Rex, people chanting this, Mark Antony trying, almost demanding that he wear a laurel wreath and things like that. Did Augustus make sure he didn't want anybody trying these sorts of things on him?
I think so, yeah.
And
that he was...
that's the reason he didn't want too much, he didn't want to be high profile.
Right, yeah. That he really did seem to learn from Julius Caesar in terms of that. Use the things that worked with Caesar and really try to avoid the things that got Caesar murdered. Yes. Let's check that off so that does not happen to me.
Right. And lastly, how did Augustus want subsequent generations of Romans to view him, and how did he want people like us to feel that he couldn't perceive? Because I have a feeling he had an idea of how he wanted to be presented, and did he get his desired result?
Yeah, I think that his all of these sculptural works of him and a lot of the art and architecture really again present this sense of this sort of republican, pious, virtuous, stable presence. And you have, he was emperor for so long that you have so many different statues of him, and yet even the ones that we can securely date towards the end of his life still present him as this very youthful, vigorous guy. And so it's the sense that no matter how old he became, that he was still this has a lot of vim and vigor and is always ready to go. And so I think that is one of the major things. Even though he realized he was creating this whole new system of government, he still wanted to be seen as somebody who was putting Rome back together again. That after years and years of civil war, tearing it apart, even though he was changing the fundamental fabric of Rome, he was saving Rome as well and putting it back together. And I think that was one of his major messages. I think that's how he wanted the rest of his family to rule. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And so by the time we get to Nero, that has certainly gone off the rails. So, yeah.
All right, thank you for being on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Thank you very much.